Judge mocks Clint Eastwood in court, only to be shocked by his genius legal skills. The courtroom was packed. Reporters scrambled for the best shots, spectators whispered eagerly, and lawyers exchanged knowing glances. They all came to witness what they thought would be the humiliation of a Hollywood actor who dared to play lawyer. Clint Eastwood stood confidently at the defense table, calm and composed. This wasn't a movie. This was real life. And Clint was representing himself. The judge, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a smug expression, cleared his throat and smirked. Well, Mr. Eastwood. I've seen you play a cowboy, a detective, even a boxer. But I didn't know you fancied yourself a lawyer too. Should I expect a dramatic monologue today? The courtroom erupted in laughter. The judge's condescending smile widened. The spectators laughed, the reporters' pens scratched eagerly, and even the opposing lawyers chuckled. To them, Clint was just an actor playing pretend in the wrong arena. Clint stood still. Unfazed. Unmoved. His piercing eyes fixed on the judge, revealing nothing. The judge continued, his voice dripping with mockery. You know, Mr. Eastwood, this is not a movie set. You can't yell cut when things get tough. Another wave of laughter swept through the courtroom. But Clint remained silent, his demeanor calm, almost calculating. The judge thought he was winning. The audience thought Clint was in over his head. No one noticed how tightly he held his legal papers. No one saw the flicker of determination in his eyes. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Clint Eastwood wasn't here to play a role. He was here to win. They mocked him. But they were about to learn just how dangerous it is to underestimate Clint Eastwood. Would you have laughed too? Or did you already see the fire behind those eyes? Stay tuned to see how Clint Eastwood turned the courtroom upside down and left them speechless. The courtroom was still buzzing from the judge's mocking remarks. Clint Eastwood stood motionless, his face a stone mask. But behind those piercing eyes, his mind was racing, calculating every possible move. This was not just any case. It was personal. The plaintiff was Robert Voss, a billionaire business tycoon with influence that reached into every corner of the city. Feared by rivals and revered by politicians, Robert had a reputation for crushing anyone who stood in his way. A year ago, Clint had publicly criticized Robert's shady business practices. In an interview, Clint called out Robert for exploiting workers and manipulating the media. It was supposed to be just an opinion, an act of standing up for the underdog. But Robert didn't take it lightly. The very next day, Clint was hit with a defamation lawsuit. The media went wild, painting Clint as reckless and arrogant. Rumors spread that his career was over, that he was finished. And Robert made sure of it. He used his connections to manipulate public opinion, turning the industry against Clint. Producers pulled out of projects, sponsors canceled contracts, and friends began to disappear. But Clint didn't back down. He refused to apologize, refused to retract his words. Instead, he vowed to fight. When offered a private settlement with a gag order, Clint tore the papers in half. The lawyers were stunned. They warned him he was making a mistake. They told him that Robert's lawyer, Harvey Blackwell, was the best in the business, known as the king of cross-examinations. A man who never lost a case. But Clint's resolve only hardened. He knew this fight was bigger than his career. It was about standing up to power. About showing the world that the truth couldn't be silenced. So, against everyone's advice, Clint decided to represent himself. His friends called him crazy. His fans were worried. Even his family begged him to hire a lawyer. But Clint had his reasons. He knew Robert had connections everywhere, including the legal world. He needed someone who couldn't be bought, who wouldn't be intimidated. Someone he could trust completely. And that person was himself. As Clint looked around the courtroom, he saw the mocking smiles, the whispering faces. They all thought he was out of his depth. That he was just an actor playing a role. But they didn't know Clint. They didn't know that before he became an actor, he had studied law. They didn't know that Clint had spent months preparing, studying every piece of evidence, every legal precedent. They didn't know that behind that calm expression was a mind as sharp as any lawyer in the room. Robert watched from across the courtroom, his lips curled into a smug grin. He thought this was just another enemy to be crushed, another battle to be won. But he had no idea what was coming. He didn't know that Clint Eastwood was about to give the performance of a lifetime. And this time, it wasn't for the cameras. It was for justice. The courtroom was silent as the trial began. All eyes were on Clint Eastwood, waiting for him to make a fool of himself. The judge looked down with a condescending smile, clearly enjoying the spectacle. The plaintiff's lawyer, Harvey Blackwell, strutted to the center of the room with confidence. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he looked every bit the legal shark he was known to be. He turned to Clint, his eyes gleaming with mockery. "Well, Mr. Eastwood," Harvey began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you rehearsed your lines well, because this isn't Hollywood." A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. Even the judge chuckled, tapping his gavel lightly. Clint stood still, his face calm and expressionless. He didn't respond. He didn't react. He simply watched. Observed. Calculated. Harvey continued, pacing back and forth. "This case is about defamation. About reckless words that caused my client, Robert Voss, immense damage." He pointed at Clint, his finger trembling with mock indignation. "This man used his celebrity status to destroy my client's reputation." The crowd murmured, eyes shifting towards Clint with judgment. Harvey smirked, seeing the shift in public opinion. He walked to the witness stand, where Robert sat looking somber, almost victimized. Harvey began questioning him, his voice soft and empathetic. "Mr. Voss, could you please tell the court how Mr. Eastwood's statements affected you?" Robert sighed, his shoulders sagging. "It was devastating. I lost business partners, friends turned their backs on me. My family received threats. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat." He wiped an imaginary tear, his performance worthy of an Oscar. The audience was visibly moved. Some even shook their heads in sympathy. Clint watched silently, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. He saw the fake sorrow, the calculated pauses. He saw the lies. But he said nothing. He just took notes. Harvey's questioning continued, painting Clint as a villain, a reckless celebrity who used his influence to ruin an innocent man. The narrative was clear. The strategy was obvious. To make Clint look like a bully and Robert the helpless victim. The judge looked pleased, nodding along with Harvey's points. The jury seemed swayed, their expressions grim as they glanced at Clint. When Harvey finally finished, he turned to Clint with a smug smile. "Your witness," he said mockingly. Clint stood up slowly. His movement was deliberate, controlled. He walked over to the witness stand, his posture calm and composed. The courtroom leaned forward, curious. This was Clint's first move. His first line. He looked at Robert, his eyes cold and penetrating. Then, his voice low and steady, he spoke. "Mr. Voss, you say my statements destroyed your business. Can you specify which companies cut ties with you?" Robert hesitated, his eyes flickering. He wasn't prepared for this. Several. I mean, many of them." Clint's gaze never wavered. "Names, Mr. Voss. I need names." Robert's throat bobbed as he swallowed nervously. Wellington Corp. and, Global Dynamics." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Wellington Corp.? Isn't that the same company you sued last year for breach of contract?" Robert's face paled. "Why, yes, but that's irrelevant." Clint's voice remained calm. "Irrelevant? Or is it that they ended their partnership because of that lawsuit, not because of my statements?" The audience gasped. Even the judge's smile faded. Robert stuttered, his composure slipping. I don't remember. Clint didn't let up. And Global Dynamics, didn't they declare bankruptcy 6 months before my interview? Robert's jaw dropped. His eyes darted to Harvey, who looked pale as a ghost. Clint continued, his voice steady and unrelenting. Seems like your business problems started long before I opened my mouth, Mr. Voss. The courtroom was dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Clint stepped back, his eyes never leaving Robert. No further questions. He walked back to his seat, his face still calm and expressionless. But his eyes burned with intensity. For the first time, the audience looked at Clint not as an actor, but as a man on a mission. A man seeking justice. The judge shifted uncomfortably, his smugness replaced by unease. Harvey looked shaken, his confidence cracked. Clint Eastwood had just made his first move. And it was devastating. But this was only the beginning. They had underestimated him. And they were about to pay the price. The courtroom was electric. Clint Eastwood had just shattered Robert's fabricated narrative with a few well-placed questions. The audience was stunned. The jury looked confused. Even the judge seemed rattled, his earlier smugness wiped clean. Harvey Blackwell, the so-called king of cross-examinations, was visibly shaken. His confident posture faltered as he realized Clint wasn't playing the role of a fool. He was playing the role of a hunter, and Robert was his prey. Harvey quickly stood up, trying to regain control. Objection. The defendant is misleading the witness. The judge hesitated, his voice uncertain. Objection overruled. It was clear the judge was losing his grip on the trial. Clint's precise questioning had left him unsure of his own bias. Clint's face remained calm, his voice steady and composed. Mr. Voss, you claim my words destroyed your reputation. But isn't it true that you were already under investigation for fraudulent business practices? Robert's face turned pale. He shot a panicked glance at Harvey, who was frantically shuffling his papers. And no. That's not public knowledge, Robert stammered. Clint's eyes gleamed. It is now. I have the documents right here. He held up a stack of papers, neatly organized and highlighted. These are the investigation reports from the Securities Commission. It seems you were already facing charges of embezzlement and fraud before I even made my statements. The audience gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing. The jury's expressions shifted from doubt to shock. Clint continued, his voice unwavering. You were losing investors. Your company's stocks were plummeting. Isn't it true, Mr. Voss, that your reputation was already in shambles before I spoke a single word? Robert's face flushed with anger and fear. This is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the defamation. Clint's gaze hardened. It has everything to do with it. You accused me of ruining your reputation to cover up your own crimes. The courtroom fell silent. No one had expected this turn of events. No one had seen this coming. Robert gripped the witness stand, his knuckles white. His confident demeanor was crumbling. His lies were unraveling. Harvey jumped to his feet, desperate to salvage the situation. Objection. This is a character assassination. Clint's voice was cold and precise. Character assassination? No, Mr. Blackwell. This is the truth. Your client lied under oath. He manipulated this court. He tried to use the legal system to silence me. The judge's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping the gavel nervously. He glanced at the jury, their faces showing a mixture of shock and anger. The tide was turning. Clint took a step closer to Robert, his presence commanding. You played the victim, Mr. Voss. You pretended to be ruined by my words, when in fact, you ruined yourself with your greed and deceit. Robert's voice shook. You're twisting this. You're making me look like the bad guy. Clint's eyes burned with determination. You don't need me to do that. You did that all by yourself. He turned to the judge, his voice firm. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case on the grounds of perjury and abuse of the judicial process. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, the audience buzzed with excitement, and Harvey shouted objections. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, his face pale and conflicted. Order! Order in the court! The noise slowly subsided, all eyes on the judge. He took a deep breath, his eyes shifting between Clint and Robert. It was clear that Clint had exposed the truth. But the judge was reluctant, struggling against his own biases. Finally, he cleared his throat. Mr. Voss, you are hereby ordered to testify again, under penalty of perjury. Robert's face drained of all color. His lies had been cornered. His deception exposed. He looked at Clint, his eyes filled with fear and hatred. Clint simply stared back, his face calm, his mission clear. He wasn't here to play the hero. He was here to make things right. The judge's voice was stern, his authority shaken. The court will reconvene tomorrow. This session is adjourned. He banged the gavel, his hands trembling. The courtroom exploded in noise once more, cameras flashing and reporters scrambling. As people filed out, Clint remained standing, his eyes still fixed on Robert. For the first time, Robert looked away, unable to meet Clint's gaze. Clint gathered his papers slowly, his movements deliberate. He had just destroyed Robert's defense, piece by piece. But he knew the battle wasn't over yet. As Clint walked out of the courtroom, whispers followed him. He wasn't just an actor. He was a force to be reckoned with. A man who wouldn't back down, no matter the odds. But Clint wasn't celebrating. Not yet. He knew Robert wasn't the type to go down quietly. He knew the real fight was just beginning. But Clint was ready. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about justice. And Clint Eastwood never walked away from a fight. The next day, the courtroom was packed even tighter than before. Word had spread about Clint Eastwood's devastating cross-examination. Reporters crowded the hallways, cameras ready, eyes hungry for the next twist. Robert Voss walked in, his face pale and weary. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous shuffle. He avoided Clint's gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor. Harvey Blackwell followed, his shoulders slumped. The once mighty king of cross-examinations looked defeated, his reputation shattered. But Clint walked in with calm confidence. He moved with purpose, his expression focused, his demeanor steady. He was no longer just a defendant. He was the hunter, and Robert was his prey. The judge entered, his face stern and serious. The courtroom fell silent. He banged his gavel once, his voice cold and commanding. This court is now in session. Robert was called to the stand, his face drawn and pale. He sat rigidly, his hands trembling as he took the oath. Clint watched him intently, his eyes piercing and unrelenting. Harvey tried to regain control, questioning Robert with soft, leading questions. But the audience could see through it. The jurors were no longer sympathetic. They were skeptical, their faces hard, their eyes cold. Clint stood up, his posture confident, his voice firm. Mr. Voss, you testified yesterday that my statements destroyed your business. But isn't it true that your financial troubles started long before that? Robert hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I don't recall. Clint's voice hardened. You don't recall? Or you don't want to admit it? Robert's face turned red. That's not. I mean, you're twisting my words. Clint's eyes were cold, his voice sharp. No, Mr. Voss. I'm revealing the truth. He walked over to the evidence table, picking up a document. These are your company's financial records, showing massive losses months before I made my statements. Care to explain that? Robert's hands shook as he took the document, his eyes widening in fear. His lies were collapsing around him. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. I don't know. I mean, there were other factors. Clint's voice was cold as ice. Other factors? Like your embezzlement charges? Like your fraud investigations? Robert's face went white as a sheet. His composure shattered, his lies exposed. The courtroom buzzed with shock. Reporters frantically wrote down every word, their cameras flashing. The jurors looked disgusted, their faces twisted in anger. Clint took a step closer, his presence intimidating. You tried to ruin me to cover up your own crimes. You filed this lawsuit to distract the public from your own scandal. Robert stuttered, his words garbled. That's not true. I was just protecting my reputation. Clint's voice was calm but devastating. Protecting your reputation? Or protecting your lies? The audience gasped. The judge's face darkened, his eyes narrowed. He looked at Robert with contempt. Clint took a deep breath, his expression resolute. I have nothing further, Your Honor. He turned and walked back to his seat, his steps measured, his demeanor calm. He had exposed Robert for what he truly was, a liar and a fraud. The judge looked at Robert, his voice cold. Mr. Voss, you are under oath. Do you wish to amend your testimony? Robert's shoulders slumped, his head bowed in defeat. His voice was a broken whisper. No. I have nothing to add. The judge's expression was harsh, his voice firm. Very well. The jury will deliberate. The jury left the room, their faces serious and determined. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Everyone could feel the tension, the weight of justice about to be served. After an hour, the jury returned, their verdict unanimous. The foreman stood up, his voice strong and clear. We find the defendant, Clint Eastwood, not guilty of defamation. We find the plaintiff, Robert Voss, guilty of perjury and fraud. The courtroom exploded in noise. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and spectators cheered. Clint stood still, his face calm and composed. But his eyes gleamed with victory. Robert collapsed into his chair, his face pale and defeated. His empire was crumbling. His lies were exposed. His reputation was destroyed, and his future was ruined. The judge banged his gavel, his voice echoing through the room. Order! Order in the court! Robert Voss, you are hereby charged with perjury and fraud. This court is adjourned. He stood up, his robes billowing as he walked out. The courtroom erupted once more, the noise deafening. Clint walked out calmly, his head held high. Reporters swarmed him, their questions overlapping. How did you do it? Did you always know he was lying? Clint simply smiled, his face calm and composed. No comment. He walked through the crowd, his steps steady, his shoulders straight. He had fought for his name, his honor, his truth. And he had won. Robert watched him leave, his eyes filled with hatred and fear. But Clint didn't look back. He didn't need to. Justice had been served. And Clint Eastwood never looked back. The courtroom was empty now. The echo of the judge's gavel still hung in the air, a symbol of justice served. Clint Eastwood stood outside the courthouse, his face calm, his eyes steady. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the city. But in Clint's world, the light had returned long before the sun began to set. Reporters crowded around him, microphones thrust in his face. Questions flew at him from every direction. How did you prepare for this case? Did you know you would win? What's your message to Robert Voss? Clint looked at the cameras, his face expressionless. But his eyes held a spark, a fire that couldn't be extinguished. He spoke slowly, his voice steady and composed. Truth always finds its way. No matter how deeply it's buried, it rises. And no matter how powerful the lies, they always fall. His words hung in the air, echoing in the silence. No one dared to interrupt. No one wanted to miss a single word. Clint looked directly into the cameras, his gaze piercing. To everyone out there fighting against lies, fighting for justice, stand your ground. Speak your truth. No matter how powerful they seem, no matter how hard they fight, they can never silence the truth. The crowd erupted in applause. Reporters shouted more questions, but Clint walked away, his head held high. He didn't need to say more. His actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. As Clint walked down the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. A message from his daughter. "Proud of you, Dad. You did the right thing. You stood up for what's right." A smile broke across Clint's face, the first real smile in months. It was never about winning. It was about standing up for the truth. About proving that integrity and justice were more than just words. He put his phone back in his pocket, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He had fought. He had won. But most importantly, he had stood by his principles. As he walked away from the courthouse, the sun setting behind him, Clint Eastwood walked away not as an actor, not as a defendant, but as a man who stood his ground. A man who spoke his truth. A man who fought for justice. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need the applause. He had his honor. And that was enough. Did you see that coming? Did you believe Clint would win, or did you think he was in over his head? Comment below and share your thoughts. Would you have the courage to stand up to lies and fight for your truth? Don't forget to like this video if you were inspired by Clint's story. Subscribe for more incredible tales of justice, integrity, and courage. And hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Remember, the truth always finds its way. No matter how powerful the lies, justice always prevails. Stay tuned for more stories of heroes who stand up against the odds. And never forget, your voice matters. Your truth matters. See you in the next story.